The churchyard in Groot-Zundert was small, surrounded by low stone walls that offered no protection from the wind that swept across the flat Dutch countryside. On the path to his father's church, Vincent van Gogh passed a grave every day. The headstone bore his own name, Vincent Willem van Gogh, born March 30, 1852. Died the same day, stillborn. Exactly 1 year later, on the same date, another boy was born to the Van Gogh family. They named him Vincent Willem van Gogh. What does it mean to be born into your own ghost? To carry a name that already exists on a tombstone you can see from your window? To know that before you drew breath, your parents had already buried a child with your identity? Imagine being that child. Imagine learning to read by tracing the letters of your own name carved in stone. Imagine your mother's face when she looks at you. Is she seeing you, or is she seeing the absence of the child who came before? Every birthday becomes a memorial. Every celebration of your existence is also a remembrance of death. The Van Gogh family never spoke directly about this arrangement, this peculiar doubling. In 19th century Netherlands, infant mortality was common enough that replacing a dead child's name was not unusual. But common does not mean inconsequential. Young Vincent would have sensed something in the silences, in the way conversation stopped when he entered a room, in his mother's distant gaze. Anna Cornelia van Gogh was not a warm woman by any account. Those who knew her described her as proper, reserved, correct in all her religious and social duties. But warmth, physical affection, the spontaneous embrace of a child who needed reassurance, these seemed beyond her capacity. Whether this coldness predated the loss of her first Vincent or was born from it, we cannot know. But the second Vincent felt it acutely. Vincent never spoke directly about this in his letters, but throughout his life he would write variations of the same haunting phrase, "I am a stranger to myself." The question that would drive him to create over 2,000 artworks in 10 years, the question that would consume him until a bullet ended his life at 37, was this: how do you prove you exist when your existence itself feels like an afterthought? Before we follow Vincent into that question, I want to ask something of you. If this story moves you, if you're curious where it leads, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support genuinely matters to me, and I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let me know. Now let me take you back to the beginning, to the world that shaped the boy who would become Van Gogh. The Netherlands of Vincent's childhood was a country of rigid social stratifications and religious certainty. The Van Gogh family occupied a respectable but modest position in this world. Theodorus van Gogh, Vincent's father, served as a Protestant minister in the Dutch Reformed Church, leading a small congregation in the overwhelmingly Catholic province of North Brabant. His salary was adequate but never abundant. His social standing derived from spiritual authority rather than wealth. The parsonage where the Van Gogh children grew up was modest but proper. Dark wooden furniture, whitewashed walls, the constant presence of religious texts and moral instruction. Meals were taken in silence or accompanied by scripture readings. Play was tolerated but not encouraged. The children were expected to be seen, to be obedient, to reflect well on their father's position. Theodorus was not a harsh father, but neither was he demonstrative. His affection came through duty. He provided for his children, educated them, concerned himself with their moral development. But did young Vincent ever sit on his father's lap? Did Theodorus ever roughhouse with his sons, laugh unreservedly, forget himself in play? The historical record suggests not. The minister's dignity, his position, his sense of propriety created a distance that Vincent would spend his life trying to cross. Anna Cornelia Carbentus, Vincent's mother, came from a family of bookbinders. She brought to the marriage connections to the arts and a certain cultural refinement, but accounts suggest she was emotionally reserved, perhaps even cold. Vincent would later describe feeling he could never reach her, never quite earn the warmth he craved. She painted watercolors occasionally, modest landscapes and flower studies that demonstrated technical competence but little passion. Vincent would watch her paint, fascinated by the transformation of blank paper into image. But she never encouraged his interest. Art, for Anna Cornelia, was a gentle accomplishment for a woman of refinement, not a serious pursuit. Certainly not something appropriate for a minister's son who should be thinking of respectable employment. The Van Gogh household expanded to 6 children: Anna, Elizabeth, Vincent, Theo, Wilhelmina, and Cornelis. The girls were raised to be suitable wives for respectable men. The boys were raised to enter professions that would maintain or elevate the family's social standing. Everything was ordered, appropriate, measured. But it was Theo, born when Vincent was 4, who became Vincent's lifeline to the world. From childhood, the 2 brothers formed a bond that transcended typical sibling affection. Theo saw something in Vincent that others missed. He never stopped seeing it. Even as children, the pattern was established. Vincent would push too hard, demand too much, say inappropriate things that embarrassed the family. And Theo would smooth things over, explain Vincent's intentions, defend him to their parents. Vincent the difficult one, Theo the diplomatic one, Vincent the dreamer, Theo the practical one, but also Vincent the passionate one, Theo the one who understood that passion. They shared a bedroom for years, these 2 brothers. Late at night, when the house was silent and their parents asleep, they would whisper about their dreams, their fears, their observations of the world beyond Groot Zundert. Vincent would describe things he had seen: a bird's nest in a hedge, the way light struck water in a ditch, the face of an old woman walking to market, with an intensity that struck Theo as both strange and wonderful. "Why do you notice such things?" Theo once asked. "How can you not notice them?" Vincent replied. "They're everywhere. They're all that matters." The family's respectability rested partly on connections in the art trade. 3 of Theodorus's brothers had become art dealers, a profession that combined commerce with culture in a way perfectly suited to rising bourgeois aspirations. The youngest uncle, also named Vincent, ran the successful Goupil and Company gallery. When young Vincent showed no aptitude for traditional schooling, this uncle offered him a position. Vincent's formal education had been a series of failures and abandonments. He attended village schools, a boarding school in Zevenbergen, a gymnasium in Tilburg. At each, he was intelligent but unable to conform to expectations. He asked uncomfortable questions during religious instruction. He drew in the margins of his notebooks instead of focusing on lessons. He was moody, withdrawn, then suddenly intense about subjects that interested him. His teachers found him peculiar. His classmates found him odd, too serious, too different. He had no friends, not really. He took long, solitary walks in the countryside, collecting beetles and birds' nests, studying plants, filling cheap notebooks with rough sketches. His family worried. What would become of a boy so unsuited to normal social life? In 1869, at 16, Vincent began work at the Goupil Gallery in The Hague. The expectation was clear. He would follow a sensible path into art dealing, earning a respectable income, eventually marrying appropriately, perpetuating the family's social position. For 7 years he appeared to be fulfilling this destiny. And at first it seemed to work. Vincent was actually good at the job initially. He had genuine enthusiasm for art, knowledge accumulated from his mother's watercolors and his uncle's conversations. He could speak intelligently to customers about composition, technique, historical context. The gallery's manager noted in early reports that young Vincent showed promise, but something in Vincent resisted the script he was supposed to follow. Or perhaps something in the script resisted him. The problem was that Vincent cared too much about the art, and not enough about the commerce. He would recommend paintings based on what he thought customers should appreciate rather than what would sell easily. He would spend hours with browsers who had no money discussing the merits of different landscape painters, while wealthy customers who wanted quick transactions waited impatiently. "You're not a teacher, Vincent," his manager told him more than once. "You're a salesman. Remember that." But Vincent couldn't remember it, or wouldn't. The distinction between what was beautiful and what was profitable seemed to him not just wrong, but obscene. How could you reduce art to mere commodity? How could you match paintings to parlours like matching curtains to wallpaper? In 1873, Goupil transferred Vincent to their London branch. He was 20 years old, living in a foreign city, boarding with the lawyer family in South London. And there he fell in love. Eugénie Loyer was the landlady's daughter. 19 years old, dark-haired, pleasant in an unremarkable way. To Vincent, she was a revelation. She represented everything he had been seeking: warmth, domestic happiness, the possibility of connection. He would come home from the gallery and find her in the kitchen preparing dinner for the boarders. The domestic scene captivated him, the ordinary miracle of a woman making a meal, the warm light, the smell of cooking, the promise of belonging to such a scene rather than merely observing it from outside. "Good evening, Mr. Van Gogh," she would say, formal but friendly. "Please, call me Vincent," he would insist, again and again, though she rarely did. He began arriving home earlier, finding excuses to be in the common areas of the house rather than in his rented room. He helped her carry groceries. He offered to fix things that were broken, a loose hinge, a sticking window, though he had no particular skill with repairs. She accepted his help with polite gratitude that he interpreted as budding affection. Vincent later described this period as the happiest of his life. He walked to work through London streets, convinced he had found the connection he had been seeking. He imagined a future. He prepared to propose. He bought a new suit, spending money he could barely afford. He rehearsed what he would say, how he would express his feelings. He chose a Sunday afternoon when he knew her mother would be visiting relatives. The house would be quiet, the setting appropriate for a declaration. He found Eugénie in the small garden behind the boarding house, hanging laundry. The spring sun was bright, the air warm. It seemed like a sign, this pleasant weather, this peaceful domestic scene. "Miss Lawyer, Eugénie, I need to speak with you about something important." She turned, clothespins in her hand, politely attentive. "Yes, Mr. Van Gogh." And he told her everything. How he had admired her from the first day he arrived, how her kindness had made London bearable, how he thought of her constantly, how he imagined a life together, how he loved her. She listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from puzzlement to alarm to something like pity. When he finally declared his feelings formally, "Will you marry me?" Eugénie informed him she was already secretly engaged to a previous lodger. She had thought Vincent understood that his attentions were those of a friendly boarder, nothing more. She was sorry if she had somehow misled him. But no, marriage was impossible. She loved someone else. "No, never, never," she said, using a phrase Vincent would later repeat in his own life when someone pursued him too intensely. The rejection was absolute. Vincent's response was a collapse so severe his employers noticed his work deteriorating. He stopped caring about sales, about appearances, about the gallery's commercial interests. He began preaching to customers about moral rather than aesthetic matters. A woman came in seeking a fashionable portrait to hang in her drawing room. Vincent steered her instead toward prints of religious paintings, speaking intensely about the spiritual emptiness of mere decoration. The woman left without purchasing anything. A merchant, looking for landscapes that would appeal to bourgeois taste, found himself subjected to a lecture about how Millet's paintings of peasants contained more truth than 1,000 pretty meadow scenes. The merchant also left empty-handed. Vincent's manager in London wrote to the Paris headquarters, "Young Van Gogh has become unsuitable for client-facing work. He seems to have suffered some kind of nervous collapse. Recommend transfer or dismissal." Goupil moved him to their Paris branch, hoping a change of scenery would restore his focus. It did not. If anything, Paris made things worse. The city's distractions, its moral looseness as Vincent saw it, its emphasis on pleasure over meaning, disturbed him profoundly. He began attending religious meetings obsessively. He spent his salary on Bibles and devotional texts rather than on adequate food. He wrote long letters to Theo, filled with scriptural quotations and warnings about worldly temptation. In 1876 they dismissed him. At 23, Vincent's expected trajectory had already failed. The respectable career his family connections had secured was gone. What remained was a young man increasingly obsessed with questions of meaning, purpose, and salvation, increasingly unable to function in ordinary social contexts. He returned to England briefly, taking a position as a teacher in Ramsgate, then as an assistant preacher in Isleworth. His letters from this period burn with religious fervour. He preached about sacrifice, about suffering, about the need to live for something beyond comfort and convention. He was searching for a way to matter, to be necessary rather than merely tolerated. The small congregation in Isleworth listened to his sermons with bewildered concern. He spoke with an intensity that seemed almost violent, his thin body rigid with conviction, his eyes burning with certainty about sin and redemption. The senior minister who had hired him gently suggested that Vincent might want to moderate his tone to offer more comfort and less condemnation. But Vincent was incapable of moderation. His faith was total, consuming, absolute. Anything less seemed like hypocrisy. In 1877 he returned to the Netherlands and attempted to enter theology school in Amsterdam. His father arranged for him to study with accomplished scholars. Vincent threw himself into Latin and Greek with desperate intensity, but he couldn't master the academic requirements, or perhaps he refused to master them. The formal study of religion felt to him like a betrayal of religious experience itself. What was the point of parsing Greek verb conjugations when souls were in need of salvation? Why spend years studying ancient languages when modern suffering demanded immediate action? The academic approach to theology seemed to Vincent like an elaborate avoidance of religion's actual demands. His tutors found him frustrating. He had the intelligence to succeed, but not the discipline, or rather, his discipline was directed entirely toward the wrong things. He would skip Greek lessons to walk through Amsterdam's poorest neighborhoods, observing the working people, the beggars, the prostitutes. He filled notebooks with sketches and observations rather than with vocabulary lists. "You must master the fundamentals," his tutor insisted. "There are no shortcuts to ministry." "Christ did not read Greek," Vincent replied. He simply spoke truth to those who needed to hear it. "Christ was Christ," the tutor said, dryly. "You are not." When that path closed, he tried a Protestant missionary school in Brussels. They accepted him provisionally, but found his preaching style too fervent, too intense, too disturbing. His trial sermons made congregations uncomfortable rather than uplifted. He spoke about suffering with too much relish, about sacrifice with too much enthusiasm. His faith seemed to long for martyrdom rather than salvation. In 1878, unable to complete the program properly, he was sent on a trial mission to the Borinage. a coal mining region in Belgium where poverty and death were daily certainties. The Borinage was hell-made geographical. Black coal dust covered everything, buildings, streets, the very air itself. The miners emerged from their shifts looking like ghosts, their faces blackened, their eyes red and hollow with exhaustion. Explosions and cave-ins killed dozens each year. Wages were subsistence level. Children as young as 8 worked in the mines. In the Borinage, Vincent found what he had been seeking, a context where his intensity seemed appropriate. He lived among the miners, shared their poverty, descended into the mines despite his terror of enclosed spaces. The first time Vincent went below ground, he thought he would die. The shaft descended into absolute darkness, the walls closing in, the air thick with coal dust and the smell of human sweat. The miners around him seemed indifferent to conditions that struck Vincent as nightmarish. They worked in passages so low they had to crawl. The air was barely breathable. Timbers creaked ominously overhead. The possibility of explosion or collapse was constant. And yet the miners joked, talked about their families, made plans for the meager wages they would earn. Vincent worked alongside them, though his soft hands blistered and his body, unused to physical labor, struggled to keep pace. But he kept at it, determined to share their experience fully. He would not be a minister who stood apart, who spoke about suffering from a position of comfort. When miners were injured in explosions, he tended to them. He had no medical training, but he could wash wounds, offer water, pray with the dying. He sat with the widows and orphans, his Dutch-accented French barely adequate to express his sympathy, but his presence testimony to his commitment. He gave away his few possessions. The church had provided him with a modest room and basic furniture. He gave the furniture to a family whose home had been destroyed in a fire. He slept on bare floors. He refused the small salary the church provided, believing a true missionary should own nothing. He stopped bathing regularly. He wore the miners' rough clothing. He ate their black bread and thin soup. He made himself indistinguishable from those he had come to serve, as though by erasing the differences he could finally achieve the connection that had eluded him his entire life. The miners appreciated his efforts, but also found him strange. A minister who insisted on sharing their poverty was admirable in theory, but unsettling in practice. His intensity, which had been too much in middle-class contexts, was still too much even here. He made people uncomfortable with the extremity of his devotion. The church authorities viewed this behavior with alarm. In July 1879, they dismissed him. His zeal, they said, was excessive. His sacrifice was unseemly. His failure to maintain proper boundaries between minister and congregation was unacceptable. A representative from the church board came to inform Vincent of the decision. He found Vincent in a miner's hovel, teaching the family's children to read using a Bible as textbook. "Mr. Van Gogh, you have been recalled. Your mission here is concluded." Concluded? I have only just begun. These people need a proper minister who understands his role. You have gone native, Mr. Van Gogh. You have forgotten that a minister serves God first, and that service requires dignity and decorum. Christ lived among... You are not Christ, the representative interrupted, echoing Vincent's earlier tutor. You are a provisional missionary who has failed to fulfill his duties appropriately. Please collect what belongings you have and return to Brussels. Vincent was 26 years old. He had failed as an art dealer. He had failed as a student. He had failed as a missionary. The religious vocation that had consumed him was gone. He had given everything to a God who had, through the medium of church officials, rejected him. He wandered. For months, in late 1879 and early 1880, Vincent moved through the mining region in a state of near complete destitution and despair. His letters to Theo from this period are sparse and anguished. He described himself as trapped, as worthless, as fundamentally unable to find his place in the world. "I am good for nothing," he wrote to Theo. "I am a burden to everyone. It would have been better if I had never been born." Theo, reading these letters in Paris, was terrified. He sent money, which Vincent sometimes used for food and sometimes gave away. He sent encouraging words which Vincent seemed unable to absorb. He begged Vincent to come to Paris to stay with him, to accept help. But Vincent could not yet. He needed to reach the bottom of something before he could begin to rise. And then something shifted. In a letter to Theo, dated October 1880, Vincent wrote about seeing miners' wives carrying sacks of coal in the snow. He described their faces, the weight they carried, the dignity in their exhaustion, and he wrote, "How can I be useful? Of what service can I be? There is something inside me. What can it be?" What emerged was not exactly a decision, but a transformation of purpose. The religious fervor that had driven him toward ministry found a new object. If he could not save souls through preaching, perhaps he could capture something of human experience through art. Perhaps he could make visible the suffering and nobility he saw in working people's faces. Vincent decided to become an artist. He had drawn occasionally throughout his life, but never with serious purpose. Now, approaching 27, with no formal training and no source of income, he committed himself completely. He wrote to Theo explaining his decision and asking for financial support. Theo, working successfully as an art dealer in Paris, agreed. For the next decade, until Vincent's death at 37, Theo would send his brother a monthly allowance of 150 to 250 francs. Without this support, nothing Vincent created would exist. The relationship between the brothers became the foundation on which Vincent's entire artistic production rested, but it was not simply financial. Theo provided emotional ballast, someone who believed in Vincent when almost no one else did. Their correspondence became Vincent's way of processing his artistic development, his philosophical investigations, his desperate loneliness. "I want to thank you for your support," Vincent wrote in one early letter. "But more than the money, I thank you for your faith in me. Without it, I would have disappeared entirely. You keep me tethered to the world." Theo's responses were practical but warm. He sent art supplies along with money. He described paintings he was seeing in Paris galleries, exhibitions that were opening, techniques being explored by contemporary artists. He gave Vincent a window into the art world while Vincent learned his craft in isolation. Vincent began teaching himself to draw. He copied prints, studied anatomy manuals, practiced perspective. His early work was crude, technically incompetent by academic standards, but something drove him forward with an intensity that overwhelmed his lack of formal skill. He drew the miners he had lived among, their bent backs and worn faces. He drew peasants working in fields, their bodies shaped by labor. He drew old women, children, workers of all kinds. His subjects were never the beautiful or the wealthy. He was documenting a world that polite art ignored. In 1881, he returned to his parents' home in Eton and encountered his cousin Key Voss, a widow with a young child. Vincent fell in love with an obsessive certainty that seemed to him like fate. Key was mourning her husband, who had died of illness the previous year. She had come to stay with her parents, who lived near the Van Gogh family. Vincent saw in her grief a vulnerability he interpreted as need. He saw in her motherhood a domestic possibility. He saw what he wanted to see. When he declared his feelings, Key responded with absolute clarity. No, never, never. Vincent refused to accept this. He pursued her for months, writing letters, appearing at her parents' house unannounced. In one notorious incident, he held his hand over a lamp flame and declared he would keep it there until Key agreed to see him. Key's father blew out the lamp. "You are not well, Vincent," he said, with a mixture of pity and alarm. "Key has made her feelings clear. You must respect them." "But I can make her happy," Vincent insisted, his hand blistered and throbbing. "She's suffering. I can help her. If she would just speak with me, if she would just understand—" "She understands perfectly. It is you who does not understand. Please leave now, Vincent. Do not return unless invited." Vincent's parents were horrified by his behavior. His father suggested Vincent leave. The pattern was becoming clear. Vincent's intensity, which felt to him like proof of the depth of his feeling, struck others as disturbing, inappropriate, impossible to accommodate. In 1882, Vincent moved to The Hague and found a mentor in Anton Mauve, an established painter who was married to one of Vincent's cousins. Mauve agreed to provide instruction. For a brief period, Vincent had what he craved: guidance, structure, a connection to the professional art world. Mauve was a respected artist specializing in pastoral scenes rendered in soft, harmonious tones. His work sold well. He represented exactly the kind of successful career Vincent's family hoped Vincent might achieve. At first, the mentorship went well. Mauve taught Vincent about color mixing, about how to prepare canvases, about working with oil paints rather than just pencil and charcoal. Vincent was a diligent student when the subject interested him. He painted a still life of vegetables under Mauve's guidance, applying the lessons carefully. "You have a good eye," Mauve told him, "but you must learn patience. Painting is not about intensity alone. It requires technical discipline." But Vincent also became involved with Clasina Maria Hornick, known as Sien, a pregnant prostitute with a 5-year-old daughter. Vincent didn't simply have an affair with Sien, he moved in with her, he planned to marry her. He saw himself as her rescuer, someone who could offer her escape from prostitution and poverty. Sien was 32, worn by difficult circumstances, alcoholic, scarred by smallpox. She was desperate and saw in Vincent a possible escape. He was gentle with her, more gentle than her clients. He promised her respectability, a home, safety for her children. Vincent drew her obsessively. Sien pregnant, Sien nursing her newborn, Sien bent over in exhaustion. These drawings are remarkable, tender, honest, completely without prurience or idealization. He saw her humanity completely. His family was appalled. Mauve broke off the mentorship, unwilling to be associated with Vincent's scandalous domestic situation. Theo urged Vincent to reconsider, warning that this relationship would destroy any chance of social acceptance. "You cannot save her, Vincent," Theo wrote. "And you are destroying yourself in the attempt." Vincent defended his choice with characteristic absoluteness. Sien needed him. She and her children deserved dignity. How could he claim to care about the suffering of working people and then abandon a woman in desperate circumstances? "Christ consorted with prostitutes," Vincent wrote back. "He saw their humanity when others saw only their sin. Should I do less?" But the relationship deteriorated. Sien's relatives interfered, demanding money, creating scenes. Sien drank more heavily. Vincent's money was never enough. His emotional needs were exhausting. The dream of domestic rescue was collapsing into squalid reality. By 1883, under sustained pressure from Theo and his family, Vincent left The Hague and abandoned Sian. He never saw her again. Years later, he learned she had returned to prostitution and eventually drowned herself in a river. For the next 2 years, Vincent wandered between his parents' new home in Nuenen and brief stays elsewhere. He painted obsessively, working on studies of peasants, weavers, agricultural labourers. His palette was dark, browns, greys, earth tones. His subjects were people whose faces bore the marks of hard labour. In Nuenen, Vincent worked in a studio his father had reluctantly allowed him to set up in the parsonage. The relationship between father and son was strained to breaking. Theodorus could not understand why Vincent insisted on this impossible artistic career. Why couldn't he find respectable employment? Why couldn't he behave normally? Meanwhile, Vincent painted from early morning until the light failed. He worked on dozens of studies of peasants' heads, trying to capture the essence of lives shaped by agricultural labour. He painted weavers at their looms in dark cottages, the rhythmic movement of their work. He painted the landscape around Nuenen, flat fields, simple cottages, pollarded willows. In 1885, he completed what he considered his first major painting, The Potato Eaters. 5 peasants sit around a small table in a dimly lit room, eating potatoes by lamplight. Their faces are crude, almost grotesque. Their hands are enormous, the hands of people who work the earth. Vincent had worked on studies for this painting for months. He had visited peasant families in their homes, observing how they ate, how they gathered around their small tables, how the lamplight fell across their faces. He had painted dozens of studies of hands that worked with soil, gnarled, powerful, honest hands. The painting was technically clumsy. Critics who saw it found it ugly, depressing, incompetently executed. The perspective was off. The anatomy was distorted. The color was muddy and unpleasant. Vincent believed it was the truest thing he had ever made. He had tried to capture not just the appearance of peasants eating, but something essential about their existence, their dignity, their relationship to the food they had earned through labor. These people have dug the earth with the same hands that now put the potatoes in their mouths. He wrote to Theo, "I wanted to show that they are different from us, that they are better than us in their honesty." The painting did not sell. No one wanted it. Also in 1885, Vincent's father died suddenly of a stroke. He collapsed on the threshold of the parsonage after returning from a walk, dead before Vincent could reach him. The relationship between father and son had never healed after Vincent's dismissal from missionary work and his scandalous personal choices. Vincent felt the loss acutely, but it was mixed with relief. The judgment that had followed him throughout his youth was gone. He was free now, though he had no idea what to do with that freedom. In 1886, Vincent made a decision that would transform his work entirely. He moved to Paris to live with Theo. Paris in 1886 was the center of the art world's most radical experimentation. The Impressionists had spent the previous decade revolutionizing how light and color could be represented. Younger artists were pushing even further, fragmenting form, intensifying color, rejecting the polished academic finish that still dominated salon exhibitions. Theo worked for Goupil and Company, now known as Bousseau, Valadon and Company. He dealt in contemporary art and knew the avant-garde artists personally. Through Theo, Vincent met Camille Pissarro, Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, Paul Signac, Émile Bernard, and others who were remaking painting. These were Vincent's first real artist friends, men who took painting as seriously as he did, who argued about color theory and composition with the same intensity he brought to everything. Finally, he had found his people, or so he thought. Initially, the Parisian artists welcomed Vincent as Theo's eccentric brother. They tolerated his intensity, his long monologues about the spiritual meaning of color, his odd manners. But over time, the same pattern emerged. Vincent was too much. His neediness exhausted them. His arguments became tedious. His inability to simply relax and enjoy social occasions created tension. Still, the artistic influence was transformative. Vincent's dark Dutch palette disappeared. Suddenly, his paintings exploded with color. He adopted the Impressionist technique of painting outdoors, capturing light directly. He began using pure, unmixed pigments. His brushstrokes became more visible, more expressive. He studied Japanese prints with obsessive attention. The flat colors, the bold outlines, the asymmetrical compositions suggested possibilities entirely different from European traditions. He made copies of prints by Hiroshige, trying to understand how such simple means could achieve such powerful effects. The Japanese prints fascinated Vincent because they seemed to achieve what he had been struggling toward: directness, honesty, a kind of visual truth that didn't depend on academic technique. The prints showed ordinary subjects, rain on a bridge, a wave, a courtesan, with complete attention and respect. Nothing was too humble to deserve careful observation. For 2 years, Vincent absorbed everything Paris could teach him. But Paris also exhausted him. The social world of artists required networking, politeness, strategic relationships. Vincent was incapable of these performances. His intensity alienated potential supporters. His arguments about art became too heated. His drinking increased. He and Theo lived in a small apartment on Rue Lepic in Montmartre. It was cramped, tense. Vincent's painting supplies took up most of the common space. His inability to sleep regular hours disturbed Theo's work schedule. His moods swung wildly, elated when work was going well, despondent when it wasn't. Theo, who loved his brother deeply, found himself worn down by the constant pressure of Vincent's presence. He needed space. Vincent needed connection. The two needs were incompatible. In February 1888, seeking escape from Paris's pressures, Vincent moved to Arles in southern France. He arrived in winter, but he had come seeking light. The south of France promised sun, color, a landscape that might match the intensity of Japanese prints. He rented a small yellow house near the railway station and began to paint with furious productivity. The initial loneliness was actually a relief. No more social obligations, no more trying to fit into artistic circles, no more disappointing Theo with his presence. Just Vincent, the landscape, and his work. He painted the orchards in bloom, the drawbridge over a canal, the plain around Arles. The light was different here, brighter, clearer, making colours more intense. He felt like he could see properly for the first time. The paintings from Arles represent Vincent at the height of his powers. His colour became more symbolic than naturalistic. Yellow meant friendship, hope, the sun's life-giving energy. Blue meant infinity, transcendence, spiritual depth. He painted sunflowers, orchards in bloom, the night sky wheeling above a cafe terrace. He worked with manic productivity. Some days he would complete multiple paintings working from dawn until he was too exhausted to continue. He ate irregularly, slept little, drove himself with the same intensity he brought to everything. But Vincent was also profoundly lonely. The intensity that made his paintings extraordinary made him unbearable as a companion. He frightened the people of Arles. He drank absinthe in cafes and talked too loudly about art. Local residents complained about the strange Dutchman who painted at odd hours and seemed half mad. He tried to make friends in Arles. He befriended the local postman, Joseph Ruler, a kind man with a magnificent beard who seemed genuinely to like Vincent. Roulin posed for several portraits, and his family became Vincent's main social contact. But even with the Roulins, Vincent was too much. His visits were too long. His conversation was too intense. He gave them paintings they didn't particularly want. He needed more connection than they could provide. Vincent developed a plan. He would create an artist colony in the South, a community of painters who would work together, share ideas, support each other. He wrote to everyone he knew, inviting them to join him in Arles. He prepared the yellow house, painting sunflowers to decorate the rooms where fellow artists would stay. Only one person accepted the invitation: Paul Gauguin. Gauguin was 40 years old, 5 years Vincent's senior, and had already established himself as a significant artist. He had abandoned a successful career as a stockbroker to pursue painting. He had spent time in Brittany and planned to escape to the tropics. He had theories about art that he expressed with authoritative certainty. Gauguin came to Arles not because he shared Vincent's vision, but because Theo had agreed to support Gauguin financially if he would stay with Vincent for a while. Theo was worried about his brother's isolation and mental state. He hoped companionship might stabilize Vincent. Gauguin arrived in October 1888. For 2 months, he and Vincent lived and worked together in the yellow house. At first, it seemed to work. They painted the same subjects, argued about color and form, visited brothels together, cooked meals. Vincent was ecstatic. He had finally achieved the artistic collaboration he had dreamed of. They would set up their easels side by side in the countryside around Arles, painting the same landscape from slightly different positions. Then they would compare results, discussing their different approaches. Gauguin painted from memory and imagination, simplifying and arranging elements for symbolic effect. Vincent painted what was before him, trying to capture the direct experience of seeing. "You're too literal," Gauguin would say. "You're a slave to appearances. Paint what you feel, not what you see." "I paint both," Vincent would reply. "The feeling is in the seeing, if you look carefully enough." But the relationship contained fundamental incompatibilities. Gauguin believed art should be created from imagination and memory, distilled from experience rather than observed directly. Vincent believed in painting what was before him, in direct engagement with the subject. Gauguin was socially adept, controlled, strategic. Vincent was socially disastrous, emotionally volatile, overwhelming. Gauguin found Vincent's neediness exhausting. Vincent found Gauguin's detachment painful. The arguments intensified. Vincent's mental state began deteriorating. He drank more. He slept irregularly. He became paranoid that Gauguin was planning to leave. "You're going to abandon me," Vincent said one evening, after too much absinthe. "Like everyone else, you're just waiting for the right moment." "I'm not abandoning you," Gauguin replied, though he was indeed planning to leave. "But this arrangement cannot continue indefinitely. We have different needs, different approaches." "You promised Theo you would stay." "I promised to try. I have tried." "But Vincent, you must see that this is not working. We argue constantly. You need more than I can give." "I need a friend. I need someone who understands." Is that too much to ask? When it means suppressing my own needs entirely, yes, perhaps it is. Well, the arguments became more frequent, more heated. The yellow house, which Vincent had imagined as a refuge of artistic communion, became a pressure cooker of incompatible personalities. On December 23, 1888, something happened. The exact sequence of events remains contested. What is certain is that Vincent cut off a portion of his left ear with a razor. What is disputed is why and what happened immediately before. One account, largely based on Gauguin's later telling, suggests that Vincent attacked Gauguin with the razor, then turned the blade on himself when Gauguin fled. Gauguin claimed he slept in a hotel that night and found out about Vincent's self-mutilation the next morning. Vincent's version, given to police, was that he had cut his own ear and could not remember why. Medical evidence shows he severed the lower portion of the earlobe, not the entire ear, as popular myth claims. After cutting himself, Vincent wrapped the severed flesh in newspaper, walked to a brothel he and Gauguin had frequented, and gave the package to a woman there named Rachel, asking her to guard this object carefully. Then he returned to the yellow house and went to bed. Police found him the next morning, unconscious, in a bed, soaked with blood. They took him to the hospital. Gauguin immediately left Arles and never returned. The studio of the South was over. Theo rushed from Paris to be with Vincent. He found his brother physically recovering, but psychologically shattered. Vincent had no clear memory of what had happened or why he had done it. He expressed horror at his own actions. He apologized to Theo for the trouble he had caused. "I don't know what came over me," Vincent said, his head bandaged, his face pale and gaunt. "I remember arguing with Gauguin and then nothing, just darkness, and then waking up here with the police standing over me." "Don't think about it now," Theo said, holding his brother's hand. "Just recover. Everything else can wait." "But Gauguin is gone, isn't he?" "Yes, he's gone. Of course he is. Everyone always goes." After 2 weeks, the hospital released Vincent. He returned to the yellow house and tried to resume painting, but the people of Arles, already wary of him, were now openly frightened. Local residents petitioned the mayor to have Vincent removed as a danger to the community. In February 1889, police forcibly returned Vincent to the hospital and locked him in an isolation cell. The yellow house was sealed. Vincent's dream of an artistic community had ended in confinement and public rejection. Over the following months, Vincent experienced what he called attacks, periods of days or weeks when he lost coherent thought, experienced hallucinations, could not paint. Between these episodes, he was lucid, productive, desperately afraid of losing his mind completely. The attacks were terrifying. He would hear voices, see things that weren't there. He would become convinced that people were trying to poison him. He would lose the ability to speak coherently. And then, gradually, he would return to himself, exhausted and shaken. In May 1889, Vincent made a decision. He voluntarily committed himself to the Saint-Paul-de-Moselle asylum in Saint-Rémy, about 20 miles from Arles. The asylum was a former monastery that had been converted to a psychiatric facility. It housed about 30 patients, most of them women. Treatment consisted primarily of baths and rest. The doctors had little understanding of mental illness beyond broad categories like epilepsy, mania, and melancholia. The building itself was beautiful in an austere way. Thick stone walls, arched corridors, a chapel that was still used for occasional services. The grounds included gardens and fields where patients could walk under supervision. Vincent was given 2 rooms, one for sleeping, one for painting. He was allowed to paint in the asylum grounds and occasionally, under supervision, in the surrounding countryside. The head doctor, Théophile Perron, took minimal interest in Vincent's case beyond basic record-keeping. The year Vincent spent at Saint-Rémy was paradoxically one of his most productive. Between episodes, he painted with extraordinary intensity. He reworked subjects from memory and imagination. He painted the olive groves around the asylum, the wheat fields visible from his window, the mountains in the distance. In June 1889, Shortly after arriving at Saint-Rémy, Vincent painted what would become his most famous work, The Starry Night. The painting shows a view from his asylum window, but radically transformed. The night sky swirls with energetic currents of wind or light. Stars and moon blaze with halos of yellow and white. A dark cypress tree rises like flame in the foreground. In the valley below, a village sleeps peacefully beneath the turbulent sky. Vincent painted it from imagination, not direct observation. It represents his internal experience more than external reality. The sky seems alive, almost violent in its movement. Yet the village remains calm, protected, oblivious to the cosmic drama above. Critics have read the painting countless ways. As vision of religious transcendence, as symptom of mental disorder, as proto-expressionist exploration of subjective experience. Vincent himself was dissatisfied with it. He felt it was too strange, too far from observation, not grounded enough in reality. He never painted another night sky like it. During his year at Saint-Rémy, Vincent also copied works by artists he admired, Delacroix, Rembrandt, Millet. These copies were not imitations but transformations. He translated their images into his own visual language, his own color sense. The practice provided stability when original composition felt impossible. When the attacks came and he couldn't work from observation, he could still copy. The familiar images were comforting, connecting him to artists he admired, giving him work to do even when his mind felt unreliable. But the episodes continued. Weeks of productivity would be interrupted by days of hallucinations, paranoia, inability to work. Vincent came to dread these attacks, to see them as evidence that his mind was dissolving permanently. In his letters to Theo during this period, Vincent wrote extensively about art, about color theory, about the paintings he was working on. But underneath the technical discussions ran a current of despair. He wrote about feeling like a burden to Theo, about the expense of his care, about the possibility that he would never recover enough to leave the asylum. "The attacks come without warning," he wrote. "I can be perfectly well one day, and the next day I cannot trust my own mind. It is a terrible way to live, Theo, not knowing when you will be yourself and when you will disappear into madness." Meanwhile, Theo was building a life Vincent could only observe from a distance. In 1889, Theo married Johanna Bonga. In 1890, they had a son whom they named Vincent Willem after his uncle. Vincent was elated by the birth of his nephew. He painted a canvas showing almond blossoms against a blue sky as a gift for the child. The flowers represented new life, spring, hope. The painting is tender, delicate, completely different from the turbulent landscapes he was painting for himself. But he also understood that Theo now had responsibilities that went beyond supporting his older brother. A wife and child needed security that Theo's income, strained by supporting two households, could barely provide. Vincent felt increasingly like he was consuming resources that should go to his nephew's future. "You have your own family now," he wrote to Theo. "You must think of them first. I am grateful for all you have done, but I cannot continue to drain you indefinitely." In January 1890, an event occurred that briefly suggested Vincent's artistic fortunes might change. Albert Aurier, a young art critic, published an essay in the Mercure de France titled Les Isolés, Vincent van Gogh. The essay praised Vincent as a visionary, a genius whose work represented the future of art. Aurier described his paintings as revelations of spiritual truth, compared him to mystics and prophets. It was the first substantial critical recognition Vincent had received. Vincent's response was complicated. He was grateful, but he also felt the praise was excessive and misplaced. He wrote to Aurier suggesting that other artists, particularly Gauguin, deserved such recognition more than he did. He seemed almost embarrassed by attention he had craved for years. Also in January, a Brussels art society called Les Duintuits invited Vincent to exhibit with them. At the exhibition, Vincent sold a painting, The Red Vineyard, for 400 francs. It was the first and only painting he sold during his lifetime. These signs of emerging recognition should have been encouraging, but by early 1890 Vincent had decided he could not remain at Saint-Rémy indefinitely. The asylum had become a prison. He wanted to be closer to Paris, to Theo, to the possibility of normal life. Dr. Peyron agreed that Vincent was well enough to leave, though he warned that complete cure was unlikely. Theo arranged for Vincent to stay in Auvers-sur-Oise, a small town about 20 miles north of Paris, under the care of Dr. Paul Gachet. Vincent arrived in Auvers on May 20, 1890. He was 37 years old. Dr. Gachet was a homeopathic physician who treated artists and collected their work. He was an amateur painter himself. Theo believed Gachet would provide medical supervision while respecting Vincent's need to work. Vincent's first impression of Gachet was mixed. He found the doctor as discouraged about his job as a country doctor as Vincent was about painting. But Gachet owned works by Cézanne and other modern artists. He understood what Vincent was trying to do. Auvers seemed to revive Vincent's spirits. He rented a small room in the inn, owned by Arthur Ravoux, and began painting the village, the wheat fields, the thatched cottages. His production rate was astonishing. In the 70 days he spent in Auvers, he completed approximately 70 paintings. But underneath the productivity, something was collapsing. On July 6, Vincent visited Theo in Paris. Theo's apartment was crowded and tense. His wife Jo was ill. The baby was fussy. Theo's employers at Boussaud-Valadon were pressuring him about his support for avant-garde art that didn't sell well. Money was tight. Vincent saw all of this. He saw the strain his presence put on Theo's life. He saw that his brother, his only real support, was overwhelmed and might not be able to continue the monthly allowance that kept Vincent alive. He returned to Auvers deeply disturbed. He had seen the strain his presence put on Theo's life. He wrote letters expressing his fear that he would always be a financial burden, that Theo would be better off if Vincent disappeared. The prospect of being a burden to you for years to come is intolerable, he wrote. You have your own family now. I am preventing you from providing for them as you should. This cannot continue. On July 27, 1890, a Sunday, Vincent left the Ravoux Inn in the afternoon. He told the innkeeper's daughter he was going out to paint. He carried his art supplies, but no painting canvas. In a field on the outskirts of Auvers, Vincent was shot in the chest. The accepted narrative, established by Theo and early biographers, is that Vincent shot himself with a revolver, but no gun was found at the scene. The bullet entered his abdomen at an oblique angle that would be difficult to achieve with a self-inflicted wound. Vincent did not die immediately, which suggests he would have had time to shoot himself again if suicide was his intention. In 2011, biographers Stephen Nafé and Gregory White-Smith proposed an alternative theory, that Vincent was accidentally shot by René Secretan, a 16-year-old who had been tormenting Vincent and who was known to carry a malfunctioning pistol. According to this theory, Vincent protected the boys involved because he was ready to die anyway. The truth cannot be definitively established. What is certain is that after being shot, Vincent walked back to the Ravu Inn, climbed the stairs to his room, and went to bed. The innkeeper found him there, conscious and smoking his pipe, with blood soaking through his clothes. Dr. Gachet was summoned. He examined the wound and determined that the bullet had lodged near Vincent's spine. Removal would be too dangerous. There was nothing to be done except wait. A telegram went to Theo in Paris. He arrived the next morning and found Vincent conscious and lucid. The brothers spent the final hours together, though no reliable record exists of what they said. We can imagine those final hours. Theo sitting beside the narrow bed in the cramped room under the eaves of the Ravu Inn. Vincent's breathing laboured, but still strong. The brothers holding hands as they had as children, when Theo was small, and Vincent would comfort him after nightmares. Perhaps they spoke of childhood, of the flat Dutch countryside, of their mother's distant affection and their father's rigid expectations. Perhaps they spoke of Paris, of the artists Vincent had known, of the paintings he still wanted to make. Perhaps they simply sat together, the connection between them requiring no words. On July 29th, at approximately 1:30 in the morning, Vincent van Gogh died in his brother's arms. According to Theo's account, Vincent's last words were, "La tristesse durera toujours." The sadness will last forever. Vincent was buried in the cemetery at Auvers. Theo ordered Vincent's easel, chair, and paintings displayed around the coffin. Dr. Gachet and a few local artists attended. The art world barely noticed. One obituary appeared in a Dutch newspaper. Theo was devastated. He had lost his closest companion, the person he had supported and believed in for a decade. In his grief, Theo became ill. His physical and mental health deteriorated rapidly. 6 months after Vincent's death on January 25, 1891, Theo died at the age of 33. Without Theo's death, Vincent van Gogh might have remained a footnote in art history, but Theo's widow, Johanna van Gogh Bonge, made a decision that would determine Vincent's legacy. Jo inherited hundreds of Vincent's paintings and over 600 letters Vincent had written to Theo. She could have sold the paintings cheaply to settle Theo's debts. Instead, she dedicated herself to promoting Vincent's work and reputation. She organized exhibitions, she loaned paintings to galleries. Most importantly, she prepared Vincent's letters for publication. The letters revealed a brilliant, thoughtful, deeply feeling person whose paintings emerged from rigorous intellectual and emotional work. They showed that Vincent was not simply mad, he was an artist of extraordinary self-awareness and discipline. The first major retrospective of Vincent's work was held in 1901, 11 years after his death. Critics began to recognize what they had missed. His bold color, his expressive brushwork, his emotional intensity pointed toward new possibilities in painting. German expressionist painters claimed Vincent as a forefather. Fauvists cited his liberation of color from naturalistic representation. Throughout the 20th century, artists returned to Vincent's work as evidence that painting could convey subjective experience directly. That technique could be secondary to emotional truth. The commercial value of Vincent's paintings rose exponentially. Works he could not sell for 100 francs during his lifetime began selling for millions. In 1990, his portrait of Dr. Gachet sold for $82.5 million, setting a world auction record. Today, Vincent van Gogh is among the most recognized artists in human history. The Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam attracts over 2 million visitors annually. Starry Night is among the most reproduced images in the world. His face, his story, his struggle have become cultural touchstones. But this commercial and popular success raises uncomfortable questions. What does it mean that Vincent's paintings, which could not support him during his lifetime, now generate vast sums for collectors and institutions? What does it mean that his suffering has been transformed into cultural commodity? The popular narrative of Van Gogh has always emphasized his complete rejection during his lifetime. But this narrative is not entirely accurate. In his final months, Vincent was beginning to receive recognition. Auria's essay represented serious critical attention. The Les 20th exhibition suggested growing interest. The sale of the Red Vineyard proved that someone valued his work enough to pay for it. Had Vincent lived longer, he might have achieved modest commercial success. He would likely never have become wealthy, but he might have earned enough to reduce his dependence on Theo. But Vincent's tragedy was not simply lack of recognition, it was his fundamental inability to connect with other people in sustainable ways. Every close relationship in his life followed the same pattern: intense initial connection, followed by increasing tension, followed by rupture. Eugénie Loyer, Kay Voss, Sian Hornig, Anton Mauve, Paul Gauguin all followed this script. The root of this pattern remains mysterious. Some scholars point to the stillborn brother, suggesting that being born as a replacement created a profound insecurity about his own legitimacy. Vincent spent his life trying to prove he deserved to exist, that his presence mattered, that he could justify the space he occupied. Others emphasized the trauma of serial rejections, each one reinforcing Vincent's belief that he was fundamentally unlovable. His response to rejection was to intensify his devotion, to give more, to love harder, which invariably drove people further away. The missionary period in the Borean Age was the clearest expression of this dynamic. Vincent's excessive zeal, his refusal to maintain appropriate boundaries, his identification with the miner's suffering, all represented an attempt to prove through extremity that he was worthy. When the church rejected him even at his most self-sacrificing, the wound was catastrophic. What transformed this wound into art was Vincent's decision to redirect his religious intensity toward painting. The missionary fervor that had been too much for the church found expression in his approach to art. He painted with the devotion of a monk at prayer. Each painting was an offering, an attempt to capture something sacred in ordinary experience. His letters reveal this explicitly. He wrote to Theo about wanting his paintings to console, to provide comfort to people whose lives were difficult. He saw art as a kind of secular ministry. Where he had failed to save souls through preaching, he would save them, or at least acknowledge their dignity, through painting. But this meant that commercial failure was not just economic disappointment, it was spiritual rejection. Every painting that didn't sell, every critic who dismissed his work, every person who found his paintings ugly or incomprehensible, each was evidence that even his art could not create the connection he needed. The paintings themselves bear witness to this longing. Consider his repeated images of chairs, empty rooms, solitary figures. Consider the cafes he painted, filled with people who do not connect with each other. Consider the night cafe, which he described as depicting the terrible passions of humanity. A room full of people, each one isolated. Or consider his self-portraits, of which he painted over 40. What was he looking for in his own face? What did he hope to find through this repeated self-examination? Perhaps evidence that he existed. Perhaps understanding of why he could not connect. After the ear incident, he painted himself with the bandage visible, documenting his wound. After his time in the asylum, he painted himself thinner, older, with the haunted look of someone who has seen the dissolution of his own mind. These portraits are not exercises in vanity. They are evidence, proof that he was there, that he saw himself, that he existed. The question of Vincent's mental illness remains unresolved by medical historians. Posthumous diagnosis is always speculative, complicated by incomplete records and changing diagnostic categories. Was it epilepsy, as Vincent himself believed? Bipolar disorder? borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, porphyria, lead poisoning from his paints. Probably the most honest answer is that Vincent suffered from multiple overlapping conditions that manifested in episodes of psychosis, depression, and suicidal ideation. These episodes were real and terrifying, but they were not constant. Between episodes, Vincent was lucid, productive, capable of sophisticated theoretical discussion about art. The mad genius narrative does Vincent a disservice. It suggests his art emerged from insanity rather than despite it. In fact, Vincent could only paint during periods of relative stability. During acute episodes, he was incapable of working. The paintings we revere were created by someone exercising disciplined control over difficult material, not by someone in the grip of madness. But the relationship between Vincent's psychological suffering and his art is not irrelevant. His paintings channel an emotional intensity that seems to exceed ordinary experience. The colors vibrate with feeling. The brushstrokes carry the trace of the hand that made them, moving with urgency across the canvas. Looking at a Van Gogh painting, you feel the presence of the person who made it. This is different from technique. Academic painters of Vincent's era could render appearances with photographic precision, but their paintings feel empty, exercises in skill rather than expressions of experience. Vincent's paintings, for all their technical limitations, feel inhabited. They carry emotional weight. Part of this comes from his color choices. Vincent used color symbolically and emotionally rather than naturalistically. He painted a yellow chair against a blue wall, not because the chair was that yellow or the wall that blue, but because the relationship between those colors conveyed something about loneliness, about simplicity, about the dignity of ordinary objects. Part comes from his brushwork. He applied paint thickly, in visible strokes that follow the contours of what he was painting. You can see wheat bending in the wind, the turbulence of clouds, the texture of bark on a tree. The paint itself becomes physical evidence of motion, energy, life. But perhaps most importantly, Vincent painted with an honesty that refused decoration or flattery. He painted a peasant's face as marked by labor without romanticizing or beautifying. He painted sunflowers as they aged and withered, not just in their brief bloom. He painted his own face as haunted and wounded. He painted the night sky as turbulent rather than peaceful. This refusal to idealize is what makes his work continue to matter. In an era of Instagram filters and carefully curated self-presentation, Vincent's paintings insist on showing things as they are, or at least as they feel to someone paying attention without illusion. The 20th century validated Vincent's approach in ways the 19th century could not. After World War I shattered optimistic narratives about progress and reason, artists increasingly turned to direct emotional expression. Expressionism, Fauvism, and eventually abstract expressionism all took from Vincent the permission to distort form and intensify color in service of feeling rather than representation. Jackson Pollock, looking at Vincent's work, recognized a kindred spirit, someone willing to make the act of painting itself visible, to let the paint be paint rather than merely a medium for depicting something else. Mark Rothko's color field paintings, with their bands of pure color meant to evoke emotional states directly, descend from Vincent's symbolic use of color. But Vincent's influence extends beyond formal innovations in painting. His life became a template, for better and worse, for how we think about artistic genius. The narrative of the suffering artist, the misunderstood visionary, the person too sensitive for this world. This narrative existed before Van Gogh, but his story gave it its most powerful form. His suicide, his poverty, his lack of recognition during life, followed by fame after death, these elements created a myth that subsequent generations of artists both embraced and resented. The myth's appeal is obvious. It suggests that commercial failure is evidence of integrity, that suffering is the price of vision, that eventual recognition is guaranteed for those who remain true to their art. The myth consoles. It promises that today's rejection will become tomorrow's vindication. But the myth is also dangerous. It romanticizes suffering rather than acknowledging it as suffering. It suggests that mental illness is somehow necessary for creativity, rather than something that made Vincent's work harder and his life shorter. It encourages artists to endure poverty and neglect rather than fighting for better conditions. Vincent himself would likely reject the myth. His letters repeatedly express his desire for connection, for recognition, for ordinary domestic happiness. He didn't want to be misunderstood. He didn't want to suffer. He wanted his paintings to be seen and valued. He wanted to earn enough to relieve Theo of the burden of supporting him. The sadness of Vincent's story is not that he was ignored. He was beginning to be recognized. The sadness is that recognition came too late, that he could not survive long enough to experience it, that the connection he sought through his art was only achieved after he could no longer know it existed. But there's another way to understand Vincent's legacy that complicates both the popular myth and the correction to it. Vincent van Gogh's work endures not because of his suffering, but because of what he managed to do despite it. He produced over 2,000 artworks in 10 years while dealing with poverty, mental illness, social rejection, and near-constant crisis. This is not romantic. This is evidence of extraordinary discipline and commitment. He taught himself to paint. He studied theory, practiced technique, analyzed masterworks, experimented with materials. His letters show someone thinking rigorously about color relationships, spatial organization, emotional effect. He was not a naive primitive. He was a highly intellectual artist who happened to work outside academic structures. He maintained this work without hope of conventional success. Year after year, his paintings didn't sell. Critics dismissed them. People found them disturbing. Yet he continued painting because the act itself was necessary to him. He painted to understand what he saw, to capture what he felt, to make visible what seemed to him sacred in ordinary life. This is perhaps the most important aspect of his legacy. He demonstrated that art could be a spiritual practice, a way of engaging with existence directly. His paintings are not merely depictions. They are encounters, moments of attention so intense that they transform what they observe. When you look at Vincent's paintings of olive trees, you're not just seeing botanical accuracy. You're experiencing his sustained attention to these trees, the way he watched them hour after hour, the way their silver leaves caught light, the way their twisted trunks seemed to writhe with inner life. The painting captures not the trees themselves, but the act of truly seeing them. This is what Vincent meant by wanting to console, not through pretty pictures, but through the evidence that someone had looked at the world carefully, had found it worthy of attention, had testified to its strange beauty, even in the midst of suffering. The question he asked implicitly throughout his work was, can we bear to see things as they are? Can we look at a peasant's worn face, a wheat field under threatening clouds, our own aging reflection, without turning away? His answer, delivered through painting after painting, was yes. Not only can we bear it, but there is something redemptive in the act of looking honestly, of bearing witness, of making permanent what would otherwise be transient. This is why his work continues to move people who know nothing about art history or post-impressionist technique. His paintings offer a model of attention, a demonstration that ordinary experience, a chair, a pair of old shoes, a field of wheat, can carry extraordinary meaning if we look long enough and honestly enough. But this model came at tremendous personal cost. Vincent's letters make clear that his intensity of vision was inseparable from his psychological suffering. He couldn't filter experience the way most people do. Everything struck him with full force. A rejection felt like annihilation. A moment of beauty felt like divine presence. He lived without the protective layers that allow most people to function in ordinary social contexts. Is this a necessary relationship? Does great art require psychological extremity? The question is dangerous because it suggests suffering should be valued as a means to aesthetic ends. But it's also honest to acknowledge that Vincent's particular form of genius was connected to his inability to function normally. His paintings carry the intensity they do, partly because he experienced everything so intensely. Perhaps the more useful question is, how do we honor what he achieved without romanticizing what it cost him? We can start by reading his letters, which show a brilliant, thoughtful person rather than a mad genius stereotype. We can acknowledge that his mental illness made his work harder, not easier. We can recognize that what he achieved was despite, not because of, his suffering. We can also acknowledge the role of structural failures. Vincent lived in a world with no effective treatment for mental illness, no social safety net for artists, no alternative career paths for someone whose intensity made conventional employment impossible. Theo's financial support was generous and loving, but it was precarious, dependent on one person's ability to continue earning. A different social structure might have allowed Vincent to produce the same work without the catastrophic isolation and poverty. Or it might not. We can't know, but we can refuse to celebrate his suffering as though it were necessary rather than tragic. The question of his death remains the final mystery. Was it suicide or accident? The traditional narrative says suicide. It fits the tortured genius myth perfectly. It provides closure. It makes sense of the pattern of his life, the mounting desperation, the fear of being a burden. But the alternative theory, accidental shooting by teenage boys, deserves consideration. The ballistic evidence raises questions. The missing gun raises questions. The fact that Vincent survived hours without calling for help immediately raises questions. And there's something in character about Vincent protecting the boys if they had accidentally shot him. Throughout his life, he took responsibility for situations that hurt him. He left Sienne rather than destroy her family's reputation. He accepted blame for the Gauguin catastrophe. He apologized to Theo for being a burden. If teenage boys shot him accidentally, Vincent might well have said nothing, accepting this as the exit he had been contemplating, and anyway, it would be both suicide and not suicide, both chosen and accidental, both tragedy and relief. We will never know for certain, but perhaps the ambiguity is appropriate. Vincent's entire life existed in the space between intention and accident, between choice and compulsion, between vision and madness. His death, poised between suicide and chance, reflects the ambiguities that defined him. What we do know is that Theo arrived in time. The brothers had their final hours together. Whatever was said, whatever reconciliation or farewell occurred, it happened between the two people who understood each other most completely. And then Vincent was gone, leaving Theo to face the loss alone. Theo's rapid decline and death 6 months later suggests how deeply intertwined the brothers' lives had been. They sustained each other. Without Vincent, Theo could not continue. Without Theo, Vincent would never have painted at all. The story of Vincent van Gogh is the story of that relationship as much as it's the story of one man's artistic vision. It's the story of how Theo's faith enabled Vincent's work, how Vincent's passion gave Theo's commercial career meaning, how two brothers created something together that neither could have achieved alone. Which brings us back to the question posed at the beginning. How do you prove you exist when your existence feels like an afterthought? Vincent's answer, delivered across 10 years and 2,000 artworks, was to make his existence undeniable through intensity of attention. If the world would not acknowledge him through conventional means, family, career, social position, he would force acknowledgement through the sheer evidence of his vision. Every painting was proof that he had been there, that he had looked, that what he saw mattered enough to record permanently. The paintings were not primarily commercial objects. They were testimonies. They said, "I was here. I saw this. It was real." The tragic irony is that this testimony only became audible after his death. During his life, the paintings were mostly rejected evidence, dismissed witnesses to experience that viewers found uncomfortable or incomprehensible. But time proved Vincent right. His paintings did become a means of connection, though not in the way he hoped. They connect millions of people to a way of seeing, to a quality of attention, to an insistence that ordinary experience contains something worth capturing. When you stand before Starry Night today, surrounded by other museum visitors, you're participating in exactly the kind of shared experience Vincent longed for. The painting creates community. It validates the feeling that the night sky is not just beautiful but terrible, not just vast, but alive with force and presence. When you look at his paintings of wheat fields, you feel the weight of agricultural labor, the dignity of working people, the connection between human effort and sustenance that urban life obscures. You see what Vincent saw, that there is something sacred in a potato, if you look at it with sufficient attention and honesty. This is the paradox at the heart of Vincent's legacy. He could not connect with people during his life, yet his work now facilitates connection for millions. He felt like an afterthought, yet his vision has become central to how we understand the possibilities of painting. The replacement child who walked past his own name on a tombstone eventually created work so vital that it could not be ignored or forgotten. He proved he existed not through conventional markers of success, but through the undeniable intensity of his attention to existence itself. The sadness, la tristesse, does last forever. It's present in every painting, every letter, every documented moment of Vincent's struggle to be seen and valued. We cannot undo his suffering. We cannot give him the recognition he needed when it might have saved him, but we can refuse to exploit his suffering. We can see past the myth to the actual person who wrote, "I am seeking, I am striving, I am in it with all my heart." We can acknowledge that his achievement was not inevitable or natural, but wrested from circumstances that would have destroyed someone less determined. And we can let his work do what he hoped it would do, help us see more clearly, feel more deeply, pay attention more carefully to the world that surrounds us. Every time someone stops in a museum and stands transfixed before one of his paintings, Vincent's project continues. Every time someone looks at an ordinary object and sees it transformed by attention, his vision persists. He exists. Not as a ghost defined by the name on a tombstone, but as a presence that continues to teach us how to look at the world with honesty and wonder. The question of whether we deserve such a teacher, whether we're worthy of the gift his suffering produced, remains uncomfortably open, but perhaps that's appropriate. Vincent van Gogh spent his life asking uncomfortable questions about worth, existence, and meaning. His work does not provide easy answers. It provides the questions themselves, made visible through color and brushstroke, preserved across time, still asking, still refusing easy comfort, still insisting that we look more carefully at what we think we already know. The sadness will last forever, but so will the paintings, so will the letters, so will the evidence that one person, against all obstacles, managed to see the world with clarity and intensity few others have achieved. That evidence, flawed, troubled, magnificent, remains. It asks us to keep looking, keep questioning, keep striving to see what's actually there rather than what we expect to find. Vincent van Gogh died believing he had failed, but failure, like success, is not the final measure. The final measure is the work itself, what it captures, what it reveals, what it makes possible for those who come after. By that measure, the man who felt like a replacement, who could not connect in life, who suffered profoundly and died young, achieved something lasting. He taught us to see the lesson continues, still urgent, still necessary, still capable of transforming how we understand our own existence in this strange and painful and occasionally beautiful world.